Welcome to the Hot Seat, a debate segment where ideas clash and insights spark. I'm your host, Hong Bin Jung. What kind of a person would do this? Those were the words Law and Home Affairs Minister K. Shanmugam used in a Facebook post 5 days ago to condemn the gruesome killing of a community cat in Yishun. For the Yishun community, the friendly feline King Kong was a well-loved member of the neighborhood. But on May 9th, King Kong was found dead at Yishun Street 51 in what the animal welfare group Looney Singapore has described as one of the most brutal it had encountered. As heartbreaking as this sounds, this gruesome act of violence is not an isolated case in Singapore. Another case of abuse was also reported earlier this week. A cat was found severely injured in Punggol and it unfortunately did not survive despite receiving medical attention. Just looking at some data here, earlier this year, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals called for stronger animal protection laws and enforcement as the number of confirmed reports of animal cruelty and welfare concerns hit a 12-year high. Another report by the SPCA saw a total of 961 confirmed reports in 2024 alone. A total of 2,190 animals were victims in such cases, with 60.7% of them being cats. So today we have to ask ourselves this. Is the current legal framework in Singapore sufficient to protect stray animals from abuse, or do Singaporeans have a moral responsibility to do so? Well, before we dive into this debate, and here's a disclaimer. The views and arguments presented by our interviewees do not necessarily reflect their personal beliefs or opinions. Instead, they are here to provide a fresh perspective on the topic at hand. On that note, if you'd like to send some questions in for our guests, feel free to WhatsApp us at 88550893. That's 88550893, or leave a comment on our Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, as we're currently streaming live on those platforms as well. So without further ado, joining us today to explain why the current legal system is enough is James Gomez, who is a senior associate at Edmund Pereira Law Corporation. And on the other side, to argue that the current legal system needs to be refreshed and that Singapore needs to have, or Singaporeans rather, needs to have more of a moral responsibility, we have Kalaivanan Balakrishnan, CEO of Animal Concerns Research and Education Society. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us. All right, we saw 2 recent cases of cat abuse just this month alone. What did you guys think when you heard about these incidents, and why is it that people commit such horrific acts towards harmless animals that are, well, beloved by our community? Maybe, James, we can get your take first.
Yep, like most Singaporeans, I was deeply disturbed because these weren't just cruel acts. They reflected malice and a complete breakdown in empathy. Now, from a legal standpoint, it underscores the importance of strong enforcement, right? But from a more human perspective, it points to something more unsettling, and that's a gap in compassion, right? And I want to be careful not to generalize society as being indifferent, because as you've rightfully pointed out, the numbers are getting higher and higher.
Right.
But that could also be because people are becoming more aware, right? Gone are the days, 30 years ago when people would only pick up the phone and call 999 because there was a murder going on. These days, a common person, an Ash or a Dominic, would pick up the phone and make that call to report anything that ought to be reported. So that's heartwarming to know that for Singaporeans, animal cruelty still ranks high. Before I answer the why, just to give perspective, in 2022, I believe, SPCA investigated 511 cases of abuse or welfare-related offences. In 2023, that rose to 915, and in 2024, 961. Now, that's a significant upward trend, right? And as to answer why people do it, there's no clear answer, right? Sometimes it's psychological, it could be a twisted need for control, and other times, sadly, it's just a sheer disregard for life. But what's clear is that our legal and social systems have to work hand in hand to deal with it.
Kalaivanan, what were your thoughts?
I think overall there was a deep sense of helplessness. I mean, that we couldn't save an innocent animal. And just overwhelming rage, actually, me and my colleagues, that someone could commit such a cruel act. I mean, the haunting feeling that we have failed these vulnerable animals, especially community animals that often live close to people and they think we are there to protect them. And we have kind of failed them. As to why these things happen, like what James said, I think could be many reasons. I think people could be stressed, there could be mental issues behind it, or I think some people could be having that violent tendencies to do such acts. However, I do think most of this is not excusable.
Right. Well, within the constitutional law, there is a law which protects animals from abuse and murder. Under the Animals and Birds Act, anyone found guilty of such an offense, including abandonment of any animal, can be imprisoned up to 18 months, fined up to $15,000 or both. Now, repeat offenders face up to 3 years jail, a fine up to $30,000 or both. And earlier this year, ST reported that the government is looking to review the Animals and Birds Act, which will include penalties to ensure that they remain effective in deterring acts of animal cruelty and abuse. So, James, if such heinous acts continue despite existing penalties, doesn't that suggest the law isn't being enforced strongly enough to deter offenders? And I mean, with the government looking to review the act, doesn't this also suggest that the current framework is not enough?
I don't believe the existence of these cases, as tragic and unsettling as they are, automatically means the law is insufficient. The fact that these cases are pursued, sometimes even prosecuted, shows that the system is functioning, right? The government's review of the Act is also not an admission of failure, but these things happen periodically. It's not a static policy system. It's one that adapts and evolves, right? If I can just zoom in on Section 42 of the Animals and Birds Act, which squarely deals with the penalty for cruelty against animals. This was amended in 2014, and prior to coming here, I did check the Hansard records. They moved the tariff from 12 to 18 months imprisonment, or a 50% increase. And that same amendment also imposed stricter penalties on businesses. The government recognized that corporate actors can cause wide-scale harm, right? And since then, if you look at case law, which I have reviewed as well, the courts have been ready to impose custodial sentences in cases involving cruelty, not so much negligence, but cruelty. Yes,
Right.
there have been consistent application of custodial sentences. So the legal framework has teeth, but we must ensure that they are being used, right? Now, where I have reservations, and this is my personal belief, is on-ground enforcement, particularly interagency cooperation. Now, legally speaking, animal cruelty under Section 42 is an arrestable offense under Section 52 of the Animals and Birds Act. Now, in principle, what it means is if I picked up the phone and called the police and said so-and-so is abusing an animal, ground patrol is empowered, or the police force is empowered to respond to the situation. They can dispatch resources to address it. But in practice, and my good friend can correct me later if I'm wrong, but I've had the experience, or the unfortunate experience, it becomes we will inform the relevant agencies, which I believe at present is NParks. Now, if I was to make a call about animal abuse at 1 a.m., I am not sure if NParks has the resources to send officers with powers of arrest down to a location at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. The police force does. And if I was to call and tell them that, look, there are 3 guys under my block at 11 p.m. drinking, I guarantee you a police car with 2 patrol officers will be there.
Right.
So there's an issue with allocation of resources, right? And that kind of delay, the gap between report and response, is where enforcement falters. And let's be honest, right? Perpetrators in animal abuse cases count on invisibility. They know that animals can't identify them.
Right.
But in a country where we can trace a pickpocket across MRT stations, void decks, parks, you name it, the whole 9 yards of what Crime Watch shows, it's a bit baffling as to how we still have unresolved animal cruelty cases or delay in investigations. So we need to ask ourselves, are we really giving NParks the resources it deserves for them to act not just in the interest of justice, but in a timely fashion to
Right.
deal with this situation? So in all, to me, it's not that the law is lacking, but I believe enforcement must evolve to match the law's intent. And until these operational gaps are closed, perpetrators will continue to exploit them.
All right. Well, James has highlighted some of the, enforcement or the lack of enforcement and the gaps in enforcement issues here. But Kalavainan, since you argue that the current system is not sufficient, what more needs to be done? I mean, what needs to be changed?
I think, like what James said. So I am always welcome harsher laws, harsher punishment, harsher penalties. But I also think that the enforcement is lacking. I mean, if you take in Southeast Asia, maybe we have the better laws, but we really need to ask ourselves how much of it is being enforced to be a deterrent. For example, in 2023, a guy got a composition fine of $1,000 for torturing and beheading a snake. And he got away with it, even though all the evidence showed that there was abuse and torture. Barry Lynn, that was a famous case where he abused multiple cats, and 2 cats died, I believe. And he only got a 14-month jail sentence. And the prosecution tried to go for 24 months, but the judge felt it was excessive. So I think very often that there's a lack of ability of our judicial system to actually uphold justice. And I think there's a lack of precedence in treating animal abuse cases seriously by the judicial system also. So I do think what we need to do, actually more than making the law harsher, is also to train judges and prosecution the link between animal abuse and the broader patterns of violence. And I also question the prosecutor priorities and the manpower, like what James said. How much manpower does MPARCS have? So right now, if you see someone torturing a cat in the middle of the night, like you said, and you call MPARCS, they will not have the manpower to come down. And by the time some action has been taken, the evidence is gone. So there must be an improvement in the manpower required to thoroughly investigate cruel acts with regards to animals. And also to touch back on Barry's case, where a person is torturing an animal, they get a 1-year ban. Many of them get a ban on keeping animals. But who is keeping track of this?
Right.
And if I'm the abuser and I'm banned from keeping an animal, my family members can still get a pet. And what happens after the 1 year? What guarantee is there 1 year that I won't return to be abusing the animals?
Right.
So there's no clarity in a lot of things, and it's not a deterrent from a person becoming a repeat offender.
Now, having said that, though, Singapore is still consistently ranked among the better countries in Asia for animal protection laws. So, Kalavainan, wouldn't you say that, then that it is also up to the average Singaporean to actively take part in preventing animal abuse and not just rely on the government to, help uphold the animal protection laws?
Definitely, absolutely. As a community, Singaporeans can and must play a greater role in protecting animals. It's not just about being more vigilant. It's also about cultivating tolerance and empathy towards all living beings. We need people to speak up when they witness cruelty or neglect. I think I very often see where a cruel act has been done, there are witnesses, but they dare not come forward either. So such silence allows the abuse to continue. Then, of course, education is also key. Are we teaching our children from young to be compassionate? Are we helping them to understand that animals are sentient beings? There is a clear lack of this thing where a lot of people don't know that animals are sentient beings. That they feel pain, fear, and suffering just as we do. So at ACRES, this is something we take pride in. We work hard to raise awareness among young people to teach them that animals do feel pain and all that. And in today's world of social media, it's easy to be entertained. There's so many videos out there, of a baby monkey dressed in a very, very nice dress, clothes, and makeup. And most people are not stopping to ask, what did the animal go through to end up there? What happens to the animal? How did the animal so there's a lot of cruelty behind a lot of these things, which gets hidden. And so a lot of people grow up not knowing what is cruel and what is not. Then I think we must also challenge cultural norms. Just because something is common or it doesn't mean that it's not cruel. So everyone has a responsibility to stay informed and reflect on what is acceptable and what is not. Finally, I believe that another way is animal protection organizations like ACRES or SPCA can be included in the judicial process as subject matter experts. So our insights on animal suffering and welfare can help ensure that justice is also informed by compassion and expertise.
All right. Well, according to Cats of Singapore, which is a website dedicated to community cats here, there's approximately 50,000 stray cats living in Singapore. James, so what moral responsibilities should Singaporeans have to protect these stray cats?
In my opinion, morality and legality should work hand in hand.
Okay.
Right? While law creates boundaries of acceptable behavior, it's our shared moral duty that sustains everyday compassion. Right? Singaporeans can play a crucial role by reporting abuse, supporting sterilization programs, and helping community cats find food and shelter. The law can prosecute abusers, right? But it cannot feed a hungry cat or care for an injured one. And in an ideal world, I'd love to agree that perhaps we should. right? But in the current one, these gaps for compassion are where civic spirit matters, right? So I think that's the balance that Singaporeans ought to strike.
I mean, animal welfare groups have been advocating for increased surveillance and community awareness to prevent such incidents, the incidents that we've seen with King Kong as well as the one in Punggol. So, James, is it possible that the lack of government intervention in reducing the number of stray animals within the community ultimately became a major factor behind the cases of animal abuse?
I think that's a very dangerous argument, and I'd hesitate to frame it or frame this as a lack of government intervention. There are ongoing sterilization and rehoming programs that are run by both state agencies and NGOs. But community animals exist in a dynamic environment, urban spaces, public housing, construction zones, so it's not so much a numbers game. It's more of the values of the people around them.
Right.
And even in cities with far fewer stray animals, abuse still occurs. So it's not merely numbers, right? It's a cultural thing. We have to be pragmatic and in what we can do to control essentially what is nature. Now, there's no single perfect plan that works, right? And let's say today every stray cat is spayed, and in 15 years we don't have any stray cats, right? Then we also have to look at environmental studies to see how that would potentially affect rodent population. So everything has a place in nature, and we can only moderate, we can't control, right? So, and that's a very delicate balance even for the government to achieve. So I wouldn't frame it that there's a lack of government intervention. I would more question society's morals. Not, as I said, I don't generalize them, but these offenders, I think they need to have a hard think.
Right. I mean, in 2023, there was a significant increase in pet abandonment cases here in Singapore, with the SPCA dealing with 137 abandonment cases involving 285 animals, a nearly threefold increase compared to 2022. Now, this trend continues in 2025, with SPCA having investigated 120 abandonment cases in the first few months of that year. So, Kalavainan, shouldn't pet owners be held responsible, not just by law, but morally as well in this case, so that the stray population doesn't increase?
Yes, pet owners definitely they should be held. They should be morally accountable, but not just legally. I think too often pet ownership is treated as a casual decision or an impulse buy rather than a serious, long-term responsibility. But keeping a pet goes far beyond being just a companionship or a hobby. It means being physically, emotionally responsible for the well-being of the animal, and this also includes proper veterinary care, daily enrichment, social interaction, and attention to their needs. So if you look at Singapore, it's not uncommon. I mean, I always see this where, you see domestic helpers helping to walk the family dog. And it often raises an important question, where does the owner actually stand in terms of direct responsibility? Delegating basic care may be convenient, but it doesn't absolve the owners of their ethical duties. So when we discuss animal welfare, the conversation often revolves around cats and dogs, but the issue is actually far broader. Take birds, for example. That is an area that, usually we don't discuss about. Currently in Singapore, there is no licensing required for keeping of pet birds, for owning pet birds. And as a result, even at ACRES, we see a huge number of abandonments in in pet birds. And many of these birds do not survive. Their suffering is largely invisible, yet very real. So pet ownership is not just a privilege, it carries a moral, legal, and social obligation. And I think every pet owner must be aware of the weight of this responsibility, not just to prevent cruelty, but to foster a society where animals are truly respected and protected.
I mean, I think earlier in the conversation we talked about why these horrific acts are happening. Mental health was one of the issues here. I mean, it seems like mental health issues are one of the, driving forces for such horrific crimes. According to an ST article, psychologists believe that people abuse animals for a wide variety of reasons, ranging from amusement to displacement of anger. So, James, doesn't this mean that the laws protecting animals against people who abuse them aren't enough to address the issue of animal abuse? I mean, how can we expect society to take more responsibility seriously when the law doesn't effectively intervene in cases where mental health is a contributing factor to an animal abuse?
That's a valid concern, but we need to understand that the law isn't meant to cure pathology, it's meant to protect. And what I mean is, if mental illness is a contributing factor, then our response has to be two-pronged. Enforcement through the courts and rehabilitation through the healthcare system. And we see that even in a prison setting, if someone's sent to prison and they've got underlying mental conditions, there's prison psychiatrists who are competent in giving treatment and in assisting with rehabilitation. Now, the existence of mental illness doesn't make the legal framework irrelevant. In fact, it makes it more important, right? To have clear and firm consequences that protect society from further harm.
Right.
And I'll explain that. A lot of people think that having a mental illness is a get out of jail free card. And that's not true. Because what matters before the court is whether the illness has a causative link to the offending behavior. For example, if a person has schizophrenia and suffers an acute episode and goes out and abuses an animal, then of course they can't be held responsible because the mental element of the crime is defeated. In such cases, the law provides that they may be put in psychiatric remand, and that's indefinite. So until a psychiatrist is satisfied that you're all right, you're not going to repeat the behavior, you can be locked up, right? That's causative link, that a mental illness was the direct reason as to why you offended, or that was the operative on the mind of the offender. Right. In another sense, if someone has perhaps a less severe case, adjustment disorder, then the court will accept that that condition played a part. It had a contributory link. It perhaps primed you towards an offending behavior, but it didn't cause the behavior. Right. And in such cases, you are still liable. Right. So it may mitigate the circumstances, but it doesn't absolve a person of responsibility or criminal liability. Right. So yes, mental health can explain conduct, but it doesn't remove accountability. And the law will still hold that person responsible either way. We've seen it, right? So even in schizophrenic cases where it's severe, there are mechanisms in the law to ensure that public or the society is protected. And on the other hand, if there's a contributory link, it may mitigate the circumstances, but not necessarily give you a get out of jail card. So that's how we balance compassion and public protection in Singapore.
All right. Well, changing perspective here as well, Khalai Vainan, if mental health issues are a major driving force behind animal abuse, can tougher laws alone ever be enough to stop such cruelty? Or are we simply punishing symptoms while ignoring the cause? How can we expect legal penalties to be, effective deterrents if we're not addressing the psychological conditions that lead people to commit such violent acts?
Yeah, I think in this day and age, stronger laws or harsher enforcement alone are not enough to end animal cruelty. I think penalties must be part of a broader multi-pronged approach, like what James was talking about, to have a more holistic approach to also address the underlying causes of abuse and foster long-term change. We should consider post-sentencing rehabilitation. Offenders should be required to complete community service with animal welfare organizations where they can be further assessed and educated. This does not necessarily mean that they have direct interaction with the animal because there still could be fears, they could have a tendency to abuse animals, but they could have some exposure to the realities of animal care and the people working with animals, and to see with an eye-opener how animals can suffer, in rescue centers as well. And I think also mandatory mental health support and psychological evaluation is important. I think it should be mandatory. Even in previous cases where the sentencing was done, the judge felt that mental health support was not needed also. So many acts of cruelty stem from deeper emotional and psychological issues, so we need these to be addressed also. And finally, education in animal welfare and sentience, like what I mentioned earlier. Offenders and the general public alike need to understand, again, that animals are sentient beings and they are capable of feeling pain, fear, and joy. Compassion can be taught, and it should be.
Right. I think we're getting both great perspectives from both of you. We've got a comment from YouTube from Jillian Summer saying, preach. But before we let you go here, just a final question very quickly, perhaps just one sentence from each of you. Can any legal framework truly protect the vulnerable stray animals without a strong moral culture that reinforces it? Or is that too idealistic for a practical society like Singapore? James?
I think no law exists in a vacuum, and legal frameworks are like guardrails. They define what must happen, but it's the moral culture of society that should determine what should happen.
Right.
So I'll leave it at that.
Khalai Vainan?
Yes, I think Singapore is a practical society. We are a result-driven society. But when it comes to animals, which are living beings, I don't think there should be a question about whether we are being too idealistic. There is a lot of suffering behind, and I do think that effort should be... Singapore has progressed so much as a society, but this is the missing link. Yeah, how do we cultivate compassion and care for all animals? That will be the missing link to bring us to the progress even further as a society.
Right, some great perspectives and arguments there. Thank you so much both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've been speaking to James Gomez, Senior Associate at Edmund Pereira Law Corporation, as well as Kalavainan Balakrishnan, who is the CEO of Animal Concerns Research and Education Society. I've been your host, Hong Bin Jung.
Traffic.
Taking a look out on the roads for you, I'm seeing heavy traffic on KPE towards TP between ECP entrance and Nicole Highway entrance. More traffic on PLE towards Changi Airport between Upper Bukit Timah Road and BKE. So if you're out there on the roads, do drive safely.
If you see anything on the roads that we might have missed, you can share it with us via SMS or WhatsApp at 8855-0893. But please send the message through only when you are safely parked.
News from the Straits Times.